In 167 BCE, a mad Greek king declared himself a living god and launched a campaign to erase Judaism from existence. In Jerusalem, he turned the sacred Jewish temple into a military brothel for Greek soldiers. Torah scrolls burned in public squares. Mothers were executed for circumcising their sons. Their infants' bodies hung around their necks as a warning. Soldiers smashed altars, outlawed the Sabbath, and forced villagers to eat pork at sword point. And in the village of Modi'in, when Greek soldiers ordered an old priest named Mattathias to sacrifice a pig, he pulled a hidden blade and killed the king's messenger on the spot. That single act of defiance lit the fuse of a rebellion that would burn across the empire. This isn't the story of emperors and generals. It's the story of rebel priests who took on a superpower and won. This is the rise of the Hasmoneans, a dynasty of warrior priests who forged the last independent Jewish kingdom for 2,000 years, born not on a throne, but on an altar soaked in blood. In 167 BCE, a Greek official sets up a pagan altar in the village square of Modi'in and demands that the people bow. He calls out one man, Mattathias, a respected Jewish priest. The message is clear: sacrifice to the Greek gods or suffer. Mattathias steps forward. He looks at the altar, the foreign soldiers, his frightened neighbors, and then he refuses. A fellow Jew steps up, willing to obey. Mattathias watches and snaps. He draws a blade, kills the apostate, then turns and murders the Greek officer in front of everyone. His sons rush in, and they slaughter the rest of the garrison. The pagan altar is torn to pieces. Then Mattathias shouts, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." And with that cry, a rebellion is born, one that will tear down a Greek empire. But how did it come to this? For decades, Judea was a cultural battlefield, caught between the great powers of the Greek world, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. The wars of Alexander's successors turned this tiny region into a strategic tug-of-war. Jerusalem changed hands 7 times in 17 years. But the real threat wasn't just military, it was cultural. Hellenism, Greek language, religion, art, science, and philosophy, was sweeping through the ancient world like wildfire. For many Jews, especially the elites, it was a symbol of progress. They built Greek-style gymnasiums, where men competed naked, and slowly began shedding Jewish customs. But for traditionalists, Hellenism was something else, a death sentence for their identity. At first, the Greek rulers tolerated Jewish religious practices, but that changed when Antiochus IV Epiphanes took the Seleucid throne in 175 BCE. He called himself God Manifest. His enemies called him Epimanes, the madman. Humiliated by Rome and desperate for money, Antiochus turned to Jerusalem's temple treasury. There he found not just gold, but a city divided by civil war. The Jewish high priesthood had become a corrupt auction. A man named Menelaus, not even from the right priestly line, bought the role by promising Antiochus a bigger cut of temple wealth. Then came the spark. While Antiochus was away campaigning in Egypt, a false rumor spread. He was dead. The ousted priest Jason staged a violent coup to reclaim power. Antiochus returned alive and furious. In 169 BCE, he stormed Jerusalem, massacred thousands, and plundered the temple. But this was just the warm-up. In 167 BCE, Antiochus launched a full-blown religious purge. Sabbath, illegal. Torah, burned in public squares. Circumcision, punishable by death. Mothers who circumcised their babies were executed. Infants hung around their necks. Imagine watching your child's naming ceremony turn into a death sentence. Then came the final insult. Antiochus entered the holy temple, erected a statue of Zeus, and sacrificed a pig on the altar. To Jews, this was not just desecration, it was the abomination of desolation. He built a fortress next to the temple, the Acra, staffed by Greek soldiers and Hellenized Jews. It loomed over Jerusalem like a dagger pointed at the heart of their faith. Sound familiar? This is what happens when empires try to erase identity. They don't just attack people, they attack memory, tradition, and belief. Faced with annihilation, many Jews fled, others died as martyrs. But in Modian, one family of priests made a different choice. They would not flee, they would not beg, they would fight, and the world would never be the same. As the old priest Mattathias lay dying, he gathered his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan, close. "The empire thinks we're finished," he whispered. "Show them what happens when you corner a lion." He looked to his 3rd son, Judah. "Be their hammer." With that, the mantle passed, and the rebellion changed forever. Judah was no ordinary rebel. He was a natural-born commander, disciplined, cunning, and utterly relentless. Soon, he earned a name that would echo through the centuries, Maccabee. It likely came from the Hebrew word for hammer, and that's exactly what he became, a weapon in human form. At first, the rebels were little more than hill fighters with farming tools. But under Judah's leadership, they became something else, a guerrilla army of divine fury. The Seleucid Empire had heavy infantry, cavalry, even war elephants. The Maccabees had terrain, speed, and unshakable faith. Judah knew the hills and ravines of Judea like a hunter knows his traps. He would never fight a stand-up battle on open ground. He didn't have to. The land itself was his weapon. The empire's first response was almost laughable. A local governor, Apollonius, marched out with a detachment to stamp out the problem. Judah waited in ambush. When the Seleucids entered the narrow valley, the Maccabees struck like thunder. Apollonius was cut down. Judah took his sword, the sword of a Greek general, and wielded it for the rest of his life. It was a small battle, but the symbolism was massive. The rebels could win. The next wave was bigger. General Seron led a professional force to crush the rebellion. He planned to march through the Beth Horon Pass, a winding ascent between cliffs. Judah prepared his men with a fiery speech. "It is easy for many to be shut up in the hands of a few. Victory in battle stands not in numbers, but strength comes from heaven." As Seron's troops wound their way up the narrow path, they couldn't form ranks. Suddenly, from the high cliffs above, the Maccabees charged. Seleucid bodies tumbled down the ravine like broken dolls. The soldiers panicked, broke formation, and ran. Beth Horon wasn't just a tactical win, it was a public humiliation. Now fully alarmed, the regent Lysias assembled a massive force, 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry. This wasn't a campaign, it was a purge. The Seleucid commander Gorgias planned a surprise night assault on Judah's camp near Emmaus, but Judah had spies. He knew. That night, under cover of darkness, Judah quietly moved his entire army out. When Gorgias arrived, the camp was empty. Thinking the rebels had fled in fear, Gorgias chased them into the hills. But the Maccabees were already circling back. At dawn, Judah attacked the main Seleucid camp, unguarded and vulnerable. Greek soldiers awoke to flames, consuming their tents. Their screams echoed off the Judean hills. The camp was in chaos, supplies burning, horses stampeding, troops scattering. By the time Gorgias returned, exhausted and confused, he saw smoke rising over the valley, his own camp in ruins. And there, on the plain below, stood Judah's army, freshly armed from the wreckage. Gorgias didn't fight. He fled, and Judah's rebels had just become a fully equipped army. In 164 BCE, Lysias himself marched out. His forces met Judah's army at Beth Zur. Once again, against overwhelming odds, Judah won. And then came the news that changed everything. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was dead. The self-declared God King, the architect of Jewish persecution, had died on campaign, humiliated and diseased. The road to Jerusalem was open. The temple, defiled and desecrated, awaited its sons. In late 164 BCE, Judah Maccabee and his brothers marched through the gates of Jerusalem, but it wasn't a homecoming. Not really. The Seleucid fortress, the Acra, still loomed above the city, filled with Greek soldiers and traitorous collaborators. But Judah didn't come for the fortress. He came for the temple. What they found broke their hearts. Weeds and shrubs choked the courtyards. The gates were scorched black. The altar to Zeus still stood, reeking of swine blood and sacrilege. The stench of pagan sacrifices still clung to the ancient stones. The holiest site in Judaism had become a monument to humiliation. So Judah ordered a total cleansing. The men, priests and warriors alike, laid down their swords and picked up shovels. They tore down the desecrated altar, stone by stone. But the stones were unclean. They couldn't be reused. They had to be buried. A new altar was built, out of pure uncut stones, just as the law commanded. They crafted new sacred vessels, including a new menorah, to replace what had been looted or destroyed. Finally, everything was ready. On the 25th day of Kislev, 3 years to the day after its desecration, the temple was rededicated. The menorah was lit. Sacrifices were offered. The people celebrated for 8 days straight, and Judah declared, "This festival shall be remembered forever," a celebration of rededication, Hanukkah. Later traditions told of a miracle, how they found only 1 jar of consecrated oil, enough for just 1 day. But somehow, it burned for 8. Literal or not, the message endures. A tiny light of faith, impossibly small, that somehow outlasts the darkness. The cleansing of the temple was a spiritual victory, the soul of a nation reclaimed. But the war was not over. As they sang songs and lit lamps in the restored temple, Seleucid soldiers still watched from the fortress above. The Maccabees had won their soul back. Now they would have to fight for their survival. Rededicating the temple was a massive victory, but for Judah the Hammer, it wasn't the end. There were still Greek garrisons, still threats, still work to finish. Judah kept fighting, with the same tactical brilliance, but no commander wins forever. In 160 BCE, at a place called Elasa, Judah and a few loyal men were surrounded by a massive Seleucid army. Most of his troops deserted, but Judah, he refused to run. He charged, and there, outnumbered, abandoned, and defiant, the hammer fell. His death shattered morale. The rebellion nearly collapsed. Hellenizers briefly regained control in Jerusalem. But the Hasmonean family? They weren't done. The mantle passed to Judah's younger brother, Jonathan. He wasn't a warrior like Judah. He was something else entirely. If Judah was the hammer, Jonathan was the stiletto. He returned to the hills, but his battlefield wasn't just the wilderness. It was the chaotic Seleucid court, now tearing itself apart with civil wars and rival claimants to the throne. Jonathan played them like a master tactician, backing one pretender, switching sides, trading loyalty for power. In 152 BCE, in a staggering twist, a Seleucid king offered Jonathan the very thing his family had rebelled to protect: the high priesthood of Jerusalem, a political bribe. The office they fought to save was now theirs, handed over by their enemy. Jonathan ruled for a decade, slowly expanding Hasmonean power, until his luck ran out. He was lured into a trap by a Seleucid general and executed. But still, the Hasmoneans endured. Now the torch passed to the last surviving brother, Simon, older, wiser, more patient. Simon waited, watched the empire rot. Then in 142 BCE, the breakthrough. A desperate Seleucid king granted Judea full tax exemption. A year later, Simon captured the Acra fortress, kicking out the last Greek troops. Judea was finally, completely free. A great assembly of people and priests gathered in Jerusalem. They named Simon and his descendants hereditary high priest, commander, and ruler. It was the birth of the Hasmonean dynasty, and they didn't just survive, they thrived. Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, became a conqueror. The Hasmonean kingdom grew, rivaling even the biblical kingdoms of David and Solomon. They expanded southward, forcibly converting the Idumeans. Rebel priests had done the unthinkable. They forged an empire. But here, the story shifts. The dynasty born from faith, from rebellion, from purity, now stood at the gates of absolute power. And power, as always, comes with a price. In 104 BCE, Simon's grandson Aristobulus I did something his forefathers never would have dared. He called himself Basileus, king. The Hasmoneans now wore two crowns, high priest and king, and that troubled many. They began to look, act, and rule like the very Greeks they once fought. Greek names, Greek customs, Greek politics, filled with backstabbing and betrayal. The kingdom fractured. A deep rift grew between the Pharisees, religious traditionalists, the Sadducees, elite, Hellenized aristocrats. Hasmonean kings like Alexander Jannaeus launched brutal civil wars against their own people. The unity that once made rebellion possible was gone. In 67 BCE, Queen Salome Alexandra died. Her sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, immediately went to war. And then they made the fatal mistake. Each brother invited a foreign power to decide the outcome. That power was Rome. The general Pompey the Great was in the area, dismantling the remains of the Greek world. He got the invitation and must have laughed. You don't invite an empire to settle your family feud. In 63 BCE, Pompey marched into Judea, laid siege to Jerusalem. After 3 months, he broke through. Pompey entered the temple, walked into the Holy of Holies, a room so sacred only the high priest could enter, once a year. He defiled it. As a message, Rome is God now. He stripped the Hasmoneans of their crown. He dismantled their kingdom. Judea was now a Roman subject. And the final, cruelest twist? Decades later, when Rome installed a puppet king of the Jews, they chose Herod the Great, an Idumean, a descendant of the very people the Hasmoneans had conquered and forcibly converted. History has a dark sense of humor. The rebel priests won freedom, forged a kingdom, then lost their souls to power. When Hanukkah candles burn today, they remind us that courage can topple empires, but power corrupts even the purest revolution. This is one past, many stories, where we unearth the rebellions and forgotten empires that changed humanity. Subscribe for more untold tales that set the world on fire.